The hour that never passed. The morning light came slowly through the thin curtains, settling across the wooden floor in pale, uneven lines. Edward Harper was already awake. He had been for hours. There was a rhythm to his mornings, one he had followed for years, maybe decades. He didn't need an alarm. The clock saw to that. Tick, tick, tick. Each room in the house had its own voice. Some were sharp and precise. Others were softer, almost hesitant. Together they formed a kind of quiet orchestra that filled the space where conversation used to be. Ed sat at the small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Black coffee. No sugar. Never sugar. Steam rose gently, fading into the cool air. He listened, not passively, but carefully. It was something he had learned over a lifetime. A clock didn't just tell time, it told stories. Where, age, memory, all of it lived inside those tiny moving parts. After a while, he stood up. The first clock was in the hallway. A tall wooden case with a glass front, slightly fogged from years of touch. He opened it slowly, as if not to disturb it, and reached inside with practiced hands. A small turn of the key, then another. The mechanism responded instantly, steady, confident. "Still with me," he murmured. He moved from room to room like that. Living room, bedroom, study. Each clock received the same attention, the same quiet respect. By the time he reached the last one, a smaller wall clock near the back window, the sun had risen higher. Outside, the trees were already turning. Deep reds, burnt orange, fading gold. Autumn had arrived quietly, just like everything else in this town. Ed adjusted the final clock and stepped back. Tick, tick, tick. He closed his eyes for a moment. Something was slightly off. Not wrong, not broken, just different. He listened again. There it was. One of the clocks, he couldn't immediately tell which, was just a fraction behind the others. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not enough to matter. But he noticed. Of course he did. He walked slowly back through the house, his steps soft against the old floorboards. The sound came and went, blending into the rest, hiding. When he reached the hallway again, he stopped. The tall clock stood exactly as before. Calm, reliable. He checked his watch. Everything matched. And yet, he lingered there longer than usual, his hand resting lightly against the wooden case. For a brief moment, the ticking seemed to echo differently, as if the house itself were remembering something he hadn't yet allowed himself to recall. Ed pulled his hand away. "It's nothing," he said quietly. But he didn't quite believe it. By midday, the air had changed. It carried that particular autumn chill, subtle but certain, the kind that settled into the edges of things, into sleeves, into shadows, into thoughts. Ed noticed it the moment he stepped outside. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest now, not in a rush, but steadily, one by one, drifting down onto the quiet street, onto the empty sidewalk, onto the worn path leading from his door. He paused there for a moment, looking out. The town moved slowly, as it always did. A car passed in the distance. Somewhere, a screen door closed. The faint sound of wind moved through the trees. Everything felt ordinary. And yet, it wasn't. Ed turned back inside. The house greeted him the same way it always did, with sound. Tick, tick, tick. He hung his coat, then stopped near the small calendar pinned beside the kitchen doorway. He hadn't looked at it that morning. Not really, now he did. The date was circled, not in bright ink, not recently, just a faint, careful mark. Old, deliberate. October 12th. His expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted. He stood there longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on that small circle. Then he reached out and touched the edge of the paper, just lightly, as if confirming it was real. "It's today," he said under his breath. The words didn't carry surprise. They carried recognition. The afternoon passed quietly. Ed kept himself busy in the workshop. Small repairs, routine adjustments, movements he could do without thinking. That was the point. The less he thought, the better. Still, his eyes drifted to the clock on the wall more often than usual. 3:42 p.m., 3:58 p.m., 4:05 p.m. Each minute landed heavier than the last. By 4:10, he had stopped working altogether. He stood in the center of the room, listening. The ticking felt louder now, sharper, as if the house itself were aware of the time. 4:14. He moved toward the doorway. 4:15. The hallway clock came into view. 4:16. He didn't breathe. 4:17 p.m. It happened all at once. No warning, no gradual slowing, just silence, complete, immediate, absolute. Every clock in the house stopped. Not one, not some, all of them. Ed stood perfectly still. He didn't rush forward, didn't react the way someone unfamiliar with the moment might. He simply closed his eyes. For a few seconds, the silence pressed in around him. Heavy, full, almost louder than the ticking had been. Then he exhaled, slowly. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze moved from one clock to another, each face frozen, each hand pointing to the same moment. 4:17. He walked into the hallway and stopped in front of the tall wooden clock. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. Older now, more tired, but not surprised. He placed his hand gently against the case. "Again," he said. Not a question, not even frustration, just acknowledgement. Outside, a single leaf drifted past the window, catching the last light of the afternoon before disappearing from view. Inside, time had stopped. And for Ed Harper, it always stopped here. The silence did not arrive gently, nor did it fade in the way quiet usually does at the end of a long day. It came all at once, complete and unyielding, filling the house so thoroughly that even the faintest memory of ticking seemed to vanish from the walls themselves. Edward Harper stood in the hallway longer than he intended, his hand still resting against the polished wood of the tall clock, as though he were waiting for it to correct itself out of habit, the way things sometimes did when given enough patience and space. But nothing moved. The minute hand remained fixed, unwavering, indifferent to expectation. He drew in a slow breath, one that felt heavier than it should have, and finally stepped away, turning toward the workshop with a quiet resolve that had guided him through every broken mechanism he had ever repaired. If something stopped, you fixed it. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. The workshop, however, felt different now, as though the absence of ticking had followed him there and settled between the tools, dulling their familiarity and turning even the smallest movements into something distant and uncertain. He reached for his instruments with practiced precision, selecting a screwdriver, then a loop, then setting them down again in an order that made sense only to him, all while avoiding the one thought that hovered just beyond his reach. It shouldn't happen like this. He approached the nearest clock, removed its casing, and examined the mechanism carefully, his eyes narrowing as he traced each gear, each pivot, each delicate connection that should have been in motion but now stood still without explanation. There was no damage, no obstruction, no wear severe enough to justify what had happened. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet nothing worked. He repeated the process with another clock, then another, moving methodically, almost stubbornly, as if repetition alone might reveal something he had missed. But each result was the same, each mechanism silent and intact, each answer leading nowhere. After a while, the effort itself began to feel unnecessary, not because he lacked the skill, but because, somewhere beneath the surface of his thoughts, he already understood that this was not something that could be repaired, not in the usual way. He lowered his tools onto the workbench with unusual care, aligning them neatly as though restoring order might somehow restore the rest, then stepped back and let his gaze drift across the room, where dozens of clocks, some open, some closed, some half-restored, stood frozen in quiet agreement. It was then that the memory came, not fully, not clearly, but enough. A sound, distant, warm, almost carried by sunlight rather than air. Laughter, not his own. Younger voices, lighter, unburdened by the weight that now filled the space where that sound had once lived. For a moment, the workshop seemed to shift, as if time itself had loosened its hold, allowing something long buried to surface just enough to be felt. Ed's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table. He did not want this. He had learned, over years that had quietly arranged themselves into decades, that memory could be more persistent than any mechanism, and far less predictable. "Not today," he said, his voice low but firm, as though the words themselves might hold the past at bay. The echo of that laughter faded just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the stillness that had come to define the house. He turned away from the bench, moving through the hallway with measured steps, each one sounding louder than it should against the wooden floor, until he reached the kitchen and stopped near the window. Outside, the light had softened, stretching long across the ground, touching the fallen leaves with a quiet kind of finality. Everything continued. The world did not pause. Only this house. Only this moment. Ed rested his hand briefly against the frame of the window, then let it fall to his side. There were things he could fix, and there were things he had chosen not to. The difference between them had never felt quite so clear. The sound of the car pulling into the driveway came as a gentle interruption, its tires crunching softly over gravel in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after hours of uninterrupted stillness. And for a brief moment, Ed remained where he was, as though deciding whether or not to acknowledge it. He already knew who it was. Marilyn never called ahead on days like this. She never needed to. By the time he reached the front door, the engine had already been turned off, and the quiet that followed carried with it a different kind of anticipation, one that felt warmer, more alive, and yet, in its own way, just as unavoidable as the silence that had filled the house before. The door opened before he could reach for the handle. "Ed," she said, her voice carrying that familiar softness that somehow managed to fill a room without ever demanding attention, and before he could respond, she had already stepped inside, bringing with her the crisp scent of autumn air and something sweeter. Apples, cinnamon, something baked with care and memory. "You should really lock this more often," she added lightly, though they both knew she appreciated that he didn't. He gave a small nod, stepping aside to let her pass, his eyes briefly catching the container in her hands, wrapped neatly in a towel as though it were something delicate. "You brought something," he said, more as an observation than a question. "I always do," she replied, moving toward the kitchen with an ease that suggested she had never truly left this place, even if years had passed between visits. The house shifted subtly around her presence. Not in sound. There was still no ticking, but in feeling. Where there had been emptiness, there was now motion. Where there had been stillness, there was now warmth. Marilyn set the container on the table and began unwrapping it with careful, practiced movements, revealing a pie whose scent quickly filled the room, settling into the quiet spaces as though it belonged there. "You haven't eaten properly," she said, not looking at him, as if the statement required no confirmation. "I've eaten," Ed replied, though without conviction. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both affection and quiet understanding, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, allowing the simple act of being in the same room to bridge the distance that words often complicated. Then, as naturally as breathing, her gaze lifted. It moved across the kitchen, past the table, past the window, and stopped. The clock on the wall. Still. Silent. Her expression did not change immediately, but something behind it did, something that shifted slowly into place, like a memory being recognized rather than recalled. "It happened again," she said. Not a question, not even quite a statement. More like the completion of a thought that had been waiting for confirmation. Ed leaned slightly against the counter, his arms resting at his sides, his posture unchanged, though the air between them had grown noticeably heavier. "Yes," he said after a moment. She stepped closer to the clock, her fingers brushing lightly against its frame, as though touch might reveal something sight could not. "And the others?" she asked quietly. "All of them." She nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer in a way that suggested she had expected nothing less, and yet still wished, perhaps, for something different. "For how long?" she asked. He hesitated. "Same as always." That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Marilyn let her hand fall, turning back toward him with a look that was neither surprised nor alarmed, but deeply, unmistakably certain. "You know what this is," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an invitation. Ed met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself before looking away, his attention drifting toward the window, where the last light of the day had begun to fade into something softer, something quieter. "It's just the clocks," he replied. The words sounded measured, careful, and entirely unconvincing. Marilyn did not argue. She rarely did, not in the way others might. Instead, she simply studied him, her expression patient, steady, as though she understood that some answers did not come from being asked once, but from being asked at the right time. After a moment, she turned back to the table, slicing the pie with deliberate precision, placing a piece on a plate and setting it in front of him without another word. "Eat," she said gently. Ed looked at the plate, then at her, and for a brief second, something in his expression softened, as though the weight he carried had shifted, if only slightly. He picked up the fork. The silence remained, but it no longer felt quite as empty. Still, it was no longer something he could ignore, and Marilyn, without pressing further, had already begun to open a door he had kept closed for far too long. Emily Carter had learned, over the course of a career built on listening more than speaking, that the most important stories were rarely the ones people told willingly, but rather the ones they hesitated around, softened, or carefully avoided altogether. That was what first drew her attention. Not the clocks themselves, nor the house, nor even Edward Harper, but the way the town seemed to bend slightly away from a particular subject, as though agreement had formed long ago without ever needing to be spoken aloud. It began, as most things did, with something small. A passing comment at the local cafe, a sentence left unfinished, a pause that lingered just a moment too long. Emily noticed those things the way others noticed changes in the weather, subtle at first, but meaningful once you learned how to read them. That afternoon, she sat by the window of the cafe, her notebook open, though she had yet to write anything, her attention divided between the quiet street outside and the conversation unfolding just behind her, where two older men spoke in lowered voices that carried just enough to be heard, but not enough to be easily understood. "Same time every year," one of them muttered. "Don't start that again," the other replied quickly, his tone edged with discomfort rather than disagreement. Emily did not turn around. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for her pen and wrote a single line. "Same time, every year." When she finally stood to leave, she did so without urgency, placing a few bills on the table before stepping out into the cool afternoon air, where the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke seemed to settle naturally into the rhythm of the town. It did not take long to find the house. There were certain places that carried their own quiet reputation, and the Harper home, with its slightly weathered exterior and windows that reflected more than they revealed, stood just apart enough from the others to feel both familiar and separate at the same time. Emily paused at the gate, not out of hesitation, but consideration, her eyes moving slowly across the structure as though committing it to memory before stepping forward. The path creaked faintly beneath her feet. The porch, though well kept, carried the marks of time in its edges, in the slight curve of the wood, in the way the railing felt smoother where hands had rested over the years. She knocked once, then waited. Inside, the silence answered first. It was not the kind of silence one expected in an empty house. It was fuller than that, denser, as though it held something within it that had not yet been released. When the door finally opened, Edward Harper stood before her, his expression neutral but attentive, his posture that of someone who had long ago learned to expect interruption without ever quite welcoming it. "Yes," he said. Emily offered a small, polite smile, the kind that suggested both respect and intent. "Mr. Harper, my name is Emily Carter," she began, her voice steady, measured. "I write for the local paper, and I was hoping I might ask you a few questions." There was a pause. Not long, but deliberate. "I'm not sure I have anything worth writing about," Ed replied, his tone calm but distant. "That may be true," Emily said gently, "but I've found that it's often worth asking anyway." Something in that answer, not its content, but its delivery, shifted the space between them just enough to allow the conversation to continue. He stepped aside. "Briefly," he said. The house greeted her immediately. Or rather, the absence of something did. Emily stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting not to the light, but to the stillness, her attention drawn instinctively to the walls, where clocks of various shapes and sizes hung in quiet alignment, their hands fixed, their faces unmoving. She did not comment right away. Instead, she walked slowly forward, her gaze moving from one clock to another, noting not only their condition, but their uniform silence, the way each one seemed to hold the same moment without variation. "They all stopped," she said eventually, her voice softer now, as though matching the tone of the room. "Yes." "At the same time?" "Yes." Emily turned toward him, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "And this has happened before." It was not phrased as a question. Ed watched her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Every year," he said. She let that settle, her mind already moving ahead, connecting pieces she had not yet fully seen, her instincts sharpening in the quiet. "And always on the same day," she continued. "Yes." "And the same time?" "Yes." There was a brief silence, one that felt less empty than intentional, as though the house itself were listening. Emily reached into her bag, pulling out a small recorder, though she did not turn it on yet. "And you've never found a mechanical reason for it?" "No." She studied him carefully, noting not just his words, but the space around them, the way he chose them, the way he avoided others. "Then it isn't mechanical," she said quietly. Ed did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the nearest clock, his expression unreadable but not unaffected. "No," he said at last, "it isn't." Emily nodded once, as though confirming something she had already suspected. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying a few loose leaves across the porch. their soft movement barely audible against the weight of the silence inside. She did not yet know the full story, but she knew, with a certainty that had guided her many times before, that she had just stepped into it. The town did not resist Emily Carter in any obvious way, nor did it openly welcome her questions, but instead responded with something far more telling, a quiet, practiced redirection that suggested not ignorance, but agreement. It was the kind of response that formed over time, shaped by repetition, reinforced by silence, and maintained not through secrecy, but through understanding. Everyone knew something. No one said enough. Emily began where she always did, without urgency, without pressure, allowing conversations to unfold naturally, guided less by direct inquiry and more by careful attention to what people chose to include, and more importantly, what they chose to leave out. At the grocery store, she asked about the weather, about the season, about how long people had lived in the area, and it was only after those easy exchanges had settled that she introduced something slightly more specific. "Do you know Edward Harper?" she asked casually, as though the name had only just occurred to her. The woman behind the counter paused, just briefly, her hands stilling for a fraction of a second before resuming their movement. "Of course," she said, her tone even. "Everyone knows Ed." Emily smiled. "And the clock's in his house?" Another pause, this one longer. "I've heard things," the woman replied, though her voice carried less certainty now. "Like what?" "Oh, just stories," she said, waving her hand lightly, as though dismissing something too vague to define. Emily nodded, as though accepting the answer, though she wrote a note the moment she stepped outside. Not stories, memories. Avoidance. At the hardware store, the response was similar. At the post office, quieter. At the cafe, more guarded. Each conversation added something, not in detail, but in shape, in tone, in the way certain words appeared consistently while others were carefully excluded. Same time, long ago, best not to bring it up. By the time the afternoon had begun to fade into evening, Emily had filled several pages without ever hearing a full account, and yet the outline of something larger had begun to take form, like an image emerging slowly through fog. It was not just the clocks. It was not just the house. It was something the entire town had chosen, collectively and quietly, to set aside. And at the center of it, there was a place. She first heard it spoken clearly by a man sitting alone outside the cafe, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street, as though he were looking not at what was in front of him, but at something much further away. "You're asking about the Harper clocks," he said without turning. Emily stopped. "I am," she replied. He nodded once, slowly. "Then you're asking about the lake." The words settled between them with a weight that none of the previous conversations had carried, its meaning not explained, but understood. Emily took a seat beside him. "What about the lake?" she asked. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, though not reluctant in the same way others had been. "It's where things changed," he said. "For who? For all of us." There was no drama in his voice, no emphasis, just fact. Emily waited, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to invite more, but not enough to demand it. After a moment, he continued. "It was a long time ago," he said, "and most people would rather remember it differently. Or not at all." "And you?" she asked. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I remember enough." Emily studied him carefully, noting the way his gaze remained fixed ahead, the way his words came slowly, measured, as though each one had been considered long before it was spoken. "What happened?" she asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, picking up a small object from the table beside him. A worn piece of metal, barely recognizable at first glance, its edges smoothed by time, its purpose unclear. He turned it over once in his hand, then set it back down. "Something that stopped more than just time," he said. Emily followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "And the clocks?" she pressed. "They just remind us," he replied. Of what, he did not say. He didn't need to. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of leaves brushing against one another. A soft, restless whisper that seemed to echo something just beyond understanding. Emily stood after a while, thanking him, though she sensed he had already said everything he intended to say. As she walked away, her thoughts moved quickly now, connecting fragments, aligning patterns, drawing a line that had not been visible before. The house, the clocks, the time, and now, the lake. She took out her notebook once more and wrote, with steady precision, 4:17 p.m., not random. Lake, central, event, shared, avoided. She paused, then added one more line. Find out who was there. Above her, the sky had begun to dim, the light softening into evening, the town settling once again into its familiar quiet. But for Emily Carter, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of direction. Memory did not return to Edward Harper all at once, nor did it arrive in clear, ordered fragments that could be easily understood or controlled, but instead unfolded slowly, like light passing through water, bending and shifting until the present began to feel less certain than the past he had tried so carefully to leave behind. It began with warmth, not the gentle fading warmth of autumn sunlight that now touched the edges of his quiet home, but something fuller, brighter, alive with movement and sound, carrying with it the unmistakable sense of a season that had once stretched endlessly forward without interruption. Summer, the kind that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The air had been thicker then, filled with a scent of grass and lake water, with laughter that rose easily and lingered long after the words themselves had faded, with voices that did not yet carry the careful restraint that years would later teach them. Ed had been younger, though not in the simple way of counting years, but in the deeper sense of moving through the world without the weight of memory pressing against every decision, every silence, every unspoken thought. The workshop had been different too, brighter, less precise. There had been tools, of course, and clocks in various stages of repair, but there had also been music playing softly in the background, and the door had remained open more often than not, allowing the outside world to drift in without resistance. Are you coming, or are you planning to spend the entire day talking to gears? A voice had called from the doorway, carrying a familiar mix of impatience and humor that required no introduction. Tom, leaning casually against the frame, younger and stronger, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested time itself had not yet begun to take anything from him. Ed had looked up, adjusting the small magnifying lens in his hand, his expression shifting from concentration to mild amusement. "I'm finishing something," he replied, though without urgency. "You've been finishing something for the past 2 hours," Tom countered, stepping inside just far enough to glance at the workbench before shaking his head with quiet disbelief. "It's not going anywhere," he added, nodding toward the clock. "But the day is." There had been a pause then, not of hesitation, but of choice. And in that moment, the choice had felt easy. Ed had set the tool down, removed the lens, and stood, brushing his hands lightly against his shirt as though leaving work behind required only a small, deliberate gesture. "Fine," he said. Tom's grin had come quickly. "Good," he replied, "because Marilyn's already there, and if we're late, she's going to make sure we hear about it." The lake had not been far. It never was. But the walk there had carried its own kind of rhythm, one that matched the pace of conversation rather than the demands of time, allowing space for small observations, for shared silence, for the easy familiarity that comes from years of knowing someone without needing to explain anything at all. By the time they reached the water, the sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long reflections across the surface that moved gently with the breeze, breaking and reforming in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their calm. Marilyn sat near the edge, her shoes set neatly beside her, her feet just touching the water, her attention fixed on something distant and unspoken, though her expression softened the moment she noticed them approaching. "You're late," she said, though without real complaint. "Barely," Tom replied, dropping down onto the grass with a quiet ease. Ed remained standing for a moment, taking in the scene with a kind of quiet appreciation he had not yet learned to question, before joining them, the three of them forming a small, unspoken circle that felt complete in its simplicity. They talked about nothing, about everything, about plans that had not yet been tested by time, about ideas that seemed solid simply because they had not yet been challenged, about the kind of future that felt certain not because it had been promised, but because it had not yet given them reason to doubt it. At some point, someone had laughed, loudly, freely, and the sound had carried across the water, echoing faintly against the far shore before fading into the evening air. It was a sound that belonged entirely to that moment, unburdened, unchanged. And for a while, that was enough. The light began to soften. The shadows stretched longer. The air cooled just slightly, signaling the quiet transition from day into evening. Ed remembered standing then, walking a few steps closer to the water, his reflection shifting beneath the surface as the ripples moved outward, distorting and reforming in a way that felt almost hypnotic. Behind him, Tom said something light, something unimportant in the way that only truly important moments can afford to be. Marilyn responded. There was another laugh. And then, the memory did not end. It simply stopped, abruptly, as if something within it refused to move forward, as if time itself had chosen that moment. Not to continue, but to hold. Back in the present, Ed's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table, his gaze unfocused as the echo of that summer lingered just beyond reach, its warmth now edged with something he could no longer ignore. It had not always been like this. There had been a time, before anything had reason to stop. Marilyn Harper had always understood that silence, when held long enough, did not disappear but instead settled into the spaces between people, shaping conversations before they began and lingering long after they ended, until what remained unsaid became more present than anything spoken aloud. She felt it now more clearly than ever, not just in the house, where the absence of ticking had turned each room into a quiet reflection of something unfinished, but in Ed himself, whose movements had grown more deliberate, more contained, as though each action required a quiet negotiation with thoughts he refused to fully acknowledge. She waited until evening, not out of hesitation, but timing. There were moments when questions could be asked, and others when they could only be resisted, and Marilyn had learned, through years of watching, listening, understanding, that forcing the wrong moment only deepened the silence she was trying to break. The kitchen light cast a warm, steady glow across the table, where the remains of dinner had been cleared but not yet put away, leaving behind small, ordinary signs of presence that felt almost significant in their simplicity. Ed stood by the sink, rinsing a plate with slow, methodical movements that suggested less about necessity and more about avoidance. "Do you remember that summer?" she asked. The question entered the room gently, but it did not go unnoticed. Ed did not turn immediately. Instead, he continued what he was doing, setting the plate aside before reaching for another, his hands steady, his posture unchanged. "Which one?" he replied, though the answer carried no real uncertainty. Marilyn watched him for a moment, her expression calm, patient, but unwavering. "You know which one," she said. That was all. That was enough. The air shifted slightly, not in temperature, but in weight, as though the room itself had recognized the direction of the conversation and adjusted accordingly. Ed finished with the second plate, placing it beside the first, then rested his hands lightly against the edge of the sink, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the window. "It was a long time ago," he said. "Yes," Marilyn agreed, her voice soft but steady. "It was." Neither of them spoke for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle, though this silence was different from the others that had filled the house. It was not empty, nor was it avoiding anything. It was waiting. Marilyn reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a small bundle of old photographs, their edges slightly worn, their surfaces carrying the faint marks of time and handling. She placed them on the table. "I found these," she said. Ed did not move, but he noticed. Of course he noticed. "Marilyn," he began, though without finishing the thought. She gently slid one photograph across the table, stopping it just within his reach. "You should look," she said. There was no pressure in her voice, no insistence, just quiet. Certainty. After a moment that felt longer than it was, Ed turned. His eyes fell on the photograph. 3 figures stood near the water, their faces turned toward the camera, their expressions open, unguarded, caught in a moment that had not yet learned how to close itself. Younger, lighter, whole. Ed stepped closer, his hand hovering just above the surface of the image before finally touching it, his fingers resting lightly against the edge as though the act itself required care. "They took that late in the afternoon," Marilyn said softly, her voice carrying memory without forcing it. "You remember that, don't you?" He did. Not just the moment the photograph was taken, but everything around it. The sound of the water, the angle of the light, the way time had seemed to stretch just enough to hold all of it without urgency. And yet, something was missing, not from the photograph, from the story. "There was someone else," Marilyn continued, her eyes still on him, not the picture. "Wasn't there?" The question settled into the room with a quiet precision that left no space for deflection. Ed's hand stilled. The memory, once distant and fragmented, began to shift again, pulling forward something he had kept just beyond reach for years, something that had never fully disappeared, only remained unspoken. "Yes," he said. The word came quietly, but it did not waver. Marilyn nodded, as though confirming not the fact itself, but his willingness to say it. "And we never talk about them," she added. Ed looked at the photograph again, his gaze tracing the familiar faces before pausing, not on what was visible, but on what was not. "We didn't know what to say," he replied. "That's not the same as having nothing to say," Marilyn answered gently. The distinction lingered. Clear. Unavoidable. Ed let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly as though the effort of holding something in place had finally begun to ease, even if only by a small degree. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, the sound brushing lightly against the windows, carrying with it the faint, restless rhythm of leaves shifting against one another. Inside, the photograph remained on the table, unchanged, but no longer ignored, and for the first time in years, what had never been said had finally begun to take shape. By the time Emily Carter reached the lake, the day had already begun its slow descent into evening, the light softening into long, stretched reflections that moved gently across the surface of the water, as though time itself had decided to slow in this particular place without needing to explain why. She had chosen to come alone, not because she preferred solitude, but because certain places seemed to ask for it, and everything she had heard, every hesitation, every unfinished sentence, every careful avoidance, had pointed her here not as a location, but as something closer to a center. The path leading down to the water was narrow and uneven, marked by years of quiet use rather than intention, its edges softened by fallen leaves that shifted slightly beneath her steps, releasing a faint, earthy scent that lingered in the cool air. There was no one else nearby, no voices, no movement beyond the slow ripple of the lake and the occasional stir of wind passing through the trees, carrying with it a sound so soft it felt less like noise and more like memory brushing against the present. Emily paused near the edge, her gaze moving outward across the water, her posture still but attentive, as though she expected something, not to happen, but to reveal itself. "This is where things changed." The words returned to her, not as a thought, but as something that seemed to exist in the space itself, repeating quietly without needing to be spoken again. She took a few steps closer. The surface of the lake reflected the sky in muted tones, pale gold fading into gray, broken only by the faintest disturbances that spread outward and disappeared before reaching the shore. It was calm, too calm, not in a way that suggested peace, but in a way that felt deliberate, as though whatever had once unsettled this place had long since settled into something quieter, something hidden just beneath what could be seen. Emily knelt slightly, brushing her fingers against the water, the cold, immediate, and precise, grounding her in the present even as her thoughts continued to drift elsewhere. 4:17, she murmured, almost without realizing it. The number had begun to take on a presence of its own, no longer just a detail, but a point around which everything else seemed to arrange itself. She checked her watch. 4:12 p.m. The coincidence, or perhaps not, settled into her awareness with quiet weight. She stood again, her attention sharpening, her senses attuned not just to what was visible, but to what might be felt, heard, or remembered. The wind shifted slightly. A small ripple crossed the surface of the lake. Then, nothing. And yet, something lingered. Emily turned, scanning the ground near the shoreline, her eyes moving slowly across the uneven mixture of stone, soil, and scattered debris that had collected there over time, most of it unremarkable, most of it easily overlooked, until it wasn't. Near the base of a low tree, partially buried beneath leaves that had not yet fully settled, something caught her attention, not because it stood out, but because it didn't quite belong. She stepped closer, knelt again, and brushed the leaves aside. What emerged was small, worn, metal. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a fragment, its surface dulled by years of exposure, its edges softened to the point where its original shape was no longer immediately clear. But as she turned it slightly in her hand, catching what little light remained, the detail began to emerge. Teeth, not sharp, but precise, evenly spaced, mechanical, a gear. Small enough to fit easily in her palm, yet intricate enough to suggest purpose, design, intention. Emily's breath slowed, her fingers tightening slightly around the object as the connection formed. Not fully, not yet, but enough to be felt. A clock, here, at the lake. She glanced back toward the water, then at her watch again. 4:16 p.m. The second hand moved, once, twice, and then, for the briefest moment, it hesitated. Not stopped, not entirely, but slowed, just enough for her to notice. Emily's gaze sharpened, her focus narrowing as the air itself seemed to hold, as though the space between seconds had stretched ever so slightly beyond what it should have been. Then it continued, normal, uninterrupted. The moment passed, but not entirely. She stood slowly, the small gear still in her hand, her thoughts moving quickly now, connecting what she had seen, what she had heard, what she had begun to understand. This was not just a story, not just a coincidence. It was a pattern, and it had a place. She slipped the object carefully into her pocket, her gaze returning once more to the lake, where the surface had returned to its earlier calm, its quiet reflection offering nothing, revealing nothing. But she knew better now. Some things did not reveal themselves easily. Some things waited. And at 4:17, they reminded you. Finding Thomas Bennett was not difficult. He was, in many ways, exactly where people expected him to be, seated outside the same cafe he had visited for years, his chair angled slightly toward the street, as though he preferred observing movement rather than participating in it, his presence steady, familiar, and quietly removed. Emily approached without hurry, her steps measured, her expression composed, though her thoughts carried a sharper edge now, shaped by what she had seen at the lake and what she suspected it meant. Tom noticed her before she spoke. He always noticed. "Back again," he said, his voice even, though not unkind, as if her return confirmed something he had already anticipated. Emily nodded slightly as she took the seat across from him, placing her notebook on the table but not opening it, choosing instead to meet his gaze directly. "I went to the lake," she said. There was no need for preamble, no reason to circle the subject. Tom's expression did not change immediately, but something in his posture shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, as though a line he had long kept intact had just been approached more closely than before. "People go there," he replied. "Not like this," Emily said quietly. She reached into her pocket and placed the small metal gear on the table between them, its surface catching the fading light in a way that made its shape clearer now than it had been before. Tom's eyes moved to it, stopped, and remained there longer than necessary. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the town, distant conversation, the passing of a car, the faint clink of dishes inside the cafe, seemed to recede, leaving only the space between them and the object that now carried more meaning than its size suggested. "Where did you find that?" he asked at last. "At the edge of the water," Emily replied. Tom leaned back slightly, his gaze still fixed on the gear, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticed, though not enough to draw attention from anyone who wasn't looking closely. "That shouldn't be there," he said. "And yet it is," Emily answered. Another pause followed, this one heavier, filled not with uncertainty, but with recognition. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, though not in secrecy, only in intention. "The clocks stop at 4:17, she said. "Every year, same day, same time." Tom did not respond. "But something else stopped too," she continued, her words steady, deliberate. "And it didn't stop in that house." His hand moved slightly on the table, fingers tightening against the surface as though grounding himself in something present, something certain. "Careful," he said quietly. "With what?" Emily asked. "With asking questions people stopped asking a long time ago." Emily held his gaze. "That's exactly why I'm asking them now." The statement did not challenge him. It met him. There was a difference. Tom exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to suggest that whatever resistance had been there was no longer as firm as it had been moments before. "It was a long time ago," he said, echoing words that had already been spoken elsewhere, though now carrying a different weight. "Time doesn't erase things," Emily replied. "No," Tom agreed, his voice quieter now. "It doesn't." He looked at the gear again, then finally reached out, turning it slightly with his fingers, the motion careful, almost reluctant, as though contact itself carried meaning. "That came from a watch," he said. Emily's attention sharpened. "What kind of watch?" Tom hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he did. "A small one," he said, "pocket-sized, old, even back then." "Whose?" she asked. The question settled between them with quiet precision. Tom's hand stilled, his gaze lifted, and for the first time since she had sat down, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not avoidance, not reluctance, but something closer to memory, pushing forward against the boundaries he had kept in place for years. "We were all there that day," he said slowly, each word measured, deliberate. "Ed, Marilyn, me." He paused. Emily waited. "And someone else," he added. The air shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Emily leaned slightly closer, her voice softer now, though no less focused. "What happened?" she asked. Tom's gaze moved past her, past the street, past the present, settling somewhere further back, somewhere that had not changed even as everything else had. "We didn't leave when we should have," he said. The words came carefully, not as a confession, but as the beginning of one. "And at 4:17, Emily pressed gently. Something happened. Tom closed his eyes briefly, the movement small but telling, as though the act itself allowed him to see more clearly what he had spent years trying not to revisit. When he opened them again, the distance remained, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer holding everything in. It was beginning to let something out. "Yes," he said. Just that. But it was enough. Because now, the story was no longer hidden. It was waiting to be told. The house felt heavier that evening, not in any way that could be measured or explained, but in the subtle, unmistakable sense that something long held in place had begun to shift, as though the silence that once protected it had quietly given way to something more demanding, something that would not remain unspoken much longer. Edward Harper moved through the rooms without purpose, or at least without admitting to one, his steps slower than usual, his attention drifting from object to object with a kind of quiet hesitation that suggested he was not simply walking, but deciding. The clocks, still frozen at 4:17, no longer felt like a disruption. They felt like a presence, a reminder, an insistence. He paused in the doorway of the study, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his gaze settling on the desk in the far corner, where a small wooden box sat exactly where it had always been, undisturbed, untouched, and yet never forgotten. For years he had passed it without stopping, not because he didn't see it, but because he did, because he knew, and because knowing had been enough to keep him from opening it. Until now. The decision did not come suddenly, nor did it feel dramatic, but rather like something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for longer than he cared to admit. finally reaching a point where avoidance required more effort than action. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, measured, as though the space between him and the desk had grown longer with time, stretching not in distance, but in meaning. When he reached the chair, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his hand hovering just above the surface of the box, his fingers slightly curled, as though the act of touching it would confirm something he had spent years keeping at a distance. "You can't leave it like this forever," Marilyn had said earlier, her voice calm but certain, carrying with it the quiet authority of someone who understood that time, when ignored, did not disappear. It waited. Ed exhaled slowly, then placed his hand on the box. The wood was cool, familiar, worn smooth in places where it had been handled long ago, though not recently. He opened it. Inside, the contents had not changed. Of course they hadn't. Time had stopped here too, in its own way, preserved not by mechanics, but by choice. A watch. Small, pocket-sized, its surface slightly tarnished, its glass scratched just enough to suggest years of use, though not enough to obscure the face beneath. 4:17. The hands had never moved. Beside it, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, carefully kept, carefully avoided. Ed picked up the watch first, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that returned instantly, as though no time had passed between the moment he last held it and now. He turned it slightly, feeling the weight of it in his palm, the quiet finality of something that had once measured time and now only marked a single, unchanging moment. "You should have told someone," a voice echoed faintly in his memory, though whether it belonged to the past or to his own thoughts, he could not say. He set the watch down, reached for the letter, and paused. Not because he didn't want to read it, but because he already knew what it contained, not in words, but in meaning, in feeling, in everything it represented and everything it had left unresolved. Still, he unfolded it, slowly, carefully. The paper made a faint sound as it opened, a quiet reminder that some things, even after years of stillness, retained their ability to be heard. The handwriting was familiar. Not his, not Marilyn's. Another voice, another presence, one that had not been spoken of, but had never truly left. He read, not quickly, not all at once, but in fragments, each line settling into place with a weight that felt both remembered and newly understood, as though time had not erased the meaning, only delayed its return. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the windows in a rhythm that almost resembled the ticking that had once filled the house, though now it carried something else, something closer to release. Ed lowered the letter. His hands remained steady, but his expression had changed, not dramatically, but in the subtle way that comes when something long resisted is finally allowed to exist without denial. "We thought we had more time," he said quietly, the words barely above a whisper, though they carried further than he expected. The room did not respond. It did not need to, because for the first time in years, he had. They gathered not by arrangement nor by plan, but by a quiet understanding that had formed between them, each arriving with the same unspoken recognition that whatever had remained hidden could no longer remain untouched. The house, still suspended in its unnatural stillness, seemed to receive them differently now, not as a place of avoidance, but as a space where something long deferred was finally ready to be faced. Emily arrived first, then Tom. Marilyn was already there, and Ed did not greet them immediately. Instead, he stood in the hallway for a moment, his hand resting once more against the tall clock, his gaze fixed on its unmoving face, as though confirming that what he was about to say belonged not only to the present, but to every moment that had led to it. When he finally turned, there was no hesitation left. They sat together in the living room, the quiet between them no longer empty, but filled with something shared, something understood even before it was spoken. Emily placed her notebook on her lap but did not open it. This was not a moment for recording. It was a moment for listening. Tom leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together in a way that suggested both readiness and restraint. Marilyn sat beside him, her posture calm, her presence steady, her gaze moving between them with quiet awareness. Ed remained standing, not out of distance, but because stillness for him had always required movement. It was late afternoon, he began, his voice even, though not detached, and we had gone to the lake the way we always did. No one interrupted. We thought we knew that place, he continued, his eyes unfocused, not avoiding the present, but looking through it. Every path, every turn, every part of the shoreline. He paused, not because he had forgotten, but because he had not allowed himself to say it before. There was someone with us, he said. The words settled quietly, not heavily, not sharply, just clearly. Emily's attention sharpened, though she remained silent. Tom's gaze lowered slightly. Marilyn did not look away. They had the watch, Ed added, his voice softer now, though no less steady. The one I kept. He took a slow breath. The water was calm, he said. Too calm, maybe. We didn't think about it. We didn't think about anything. The memory moved forward. Not all at once, but enough. There was a moment, Tom said quietly, his voice joining the story not as an interruption, but as a continuation, when things changed and we didn't see it right away. Ed nodded once. We were talking, he continued, laughing, the way you do when you think the day will just keep going. Another pause. Longer this time. And then it didn't. The words were simple, but they held. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle, careful not to disturb what was unfolding. What happened at 417? She asked. Ed looked at her, not with resistance, but with recognition. We lost track of them, he said. The room stilled. Not for long, he added quickly, as though correcting something that could not be corrected. Just a moment. A few seconds, maybe. Tom's hands tightened slightly. It was enough, he said. Ed nodded. We thought they had stepped away, he continued. But when we turned back, he stopped. Not because he couldn't continue, but because the moment itself resisted being simplified. They were gone, Marilyn said softly, completing what he could not. Ed closed his eyes briefly. Yes, he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of realization, of the weight of something that had never truly left, only remained unspoken. We searched, Tom added, his voice lower now, steadier. Right away, all of us, every part of the shoreline, calling out, waiting for an answer that never came. Emily's breath slowed, her attention fixed on the space between them, where the story now existed not as something hidden, but as something shared. And the watch? She asked quietly. Ed's gaze shifted. We found it, he said. Later, near the water. Emily's hand moved slightly toward her pocket, where the small gear still rested, though she did not take it out. And the time? She asked. Ed looked at the clock behind her. Still 4:17. It stopped then, he said. The watch, the moment, everything. Tom leaned back slightly, his expression worn but no longer guarded. We told people what we could, he said, but not everything. Because we didn't understand it, Marilyn added. And because we didn't want to, Ed finished. The truth, now spoken, did not resolve anything immediately. It did not undo what had happened. It did not change the past, but it did something else. It allowed it to exist without silence. Emily sat back slowly, her expression thoughtful, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. And the clocks? She asked. Ed looked around the room, at the still faces, at the unmoving hands. They remember, he said. No one argued. Because now? They all did. For a long moment after the story had been spoken aloud, no one moved to fill the silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had already been said carried enough weight to settle into the room on its own, reshaping the space between them into something quieter, clearer, and far more honest than it had been before. Edward Harper remained where he stood, though his posture had changed in a way that was difficult to define, as though the act of speaking had shifted something internal that could not easily be returned to its previous state, leaving him both lighter and more exposed at the same time. Emily was the first to look toward the clocks again, her gaze moving slowly across the walls, taking in each frozen face, each unmoving hand, each identical moment held in place with quiet persistence. They all stop, she said, not as a question, but as a continuation of understanding, not because they break, but because something holds them there. Ed followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful, though no longer guarded. Yes, he said. Tom shifted slightly in his chair, his attention returning to Ed with a kind of steady focus that suggested he, too, had begun to see something differently. You fixed these clocks, Tom said, his voice calm but deliberate. Every one of them. I did, Ed replied, and they all stop at the same time. Yes. Tom nodded once, slowly. That's not coincidence. No, Ed agreed. The words settled without resistance. Marilyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting gently in her lap, her voice soft but unwavering. Then what is it? She asked. Ed did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the nearest clock, his steps unhurried, his hand lifting to rest lightly against its frame, in a gesture that felt less like examination and more like acknowledgement. "I repaired most of these over the years," he began, his voice steady, though quieter now, as though speaking not just to them, but to the room itself, to the time it held, to the memory it carried. "Some were broken when they came to me. Others just stopped working the way they should." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass. "I always believed that if you understood how something worked, really understood it, you could fix it," he continued. Emily listened closely, her expression intent, her thoughts moving ahead even as his words unfolded. "And the watch?" she asked. Ed nodded slightly. "That was the first thing I tried to fix," he said. The day after, Tom's gaze lowered. Marilyn did not move. "It wouldn't move," Ed continued, his voice tightening just slightly, though not with frustration, but with memory. "There was nothing wrong with it. Nothing I could point to, nothing I could adjust, nothing I could replace." He looked down at his hand, as though the feeling of that moment still lingered there. "I spent hours on it," he said. "Then days." "And?" Emily asked quietly. Ed exhaled. "And I stopped trying," he said. The admission carried more than the words themselves. "I told myself it couldn't be fixed," he continued, "that some things just stopped." Marilyn watched him carefully. "But you didn't believe that," she said. Ed looked at her. "No," he said, "I didn't." A brief silence followed, not empty, but reflective. "Years later," Ed continued, "when I started working on the clocks again, I noticed something." Emily leaned forward slightly. "What?" she asked. "They didn't stop because they were broken," he said. "They stopped because I expected them to." The room stilled, not dramatically, but completely. "I never said it out loud," Ed added, his voice steady now, clearer, as though the truth, once formed, no longer required effort to hold. "But every year, on this day, at that time, I waited for it." Tom's expression shifted. "You held it there," he said. Ed nodded. "Not with my hands," he replied, "but with everything else." Emily's eyes moved again to the clocks, to the stillness that now felt less like a mystery and more like a reflection. "You didn't let the moment pass," she said. Ed met her gaze. "No," he said, "I didn't." Marilyn's voice softened, because letting it pass would mean, he finished the thought quietly, that it was over. The words did not echo. They settled, because they were true. And in that truth, something shifted. Not in the clocks, not yet, but in the space around them, in the way the moment was held, in the way it might, finally, be released. They did not decide to go to the lake in any formal way, nor did anyone suggest it directly. But as the evening settled and the conversation thinned into something quieter and more reflective, it became clear that there was only one place left for them to go if what had begun inside the house was to be completed anywhere at all. The walk there felt different this time. Not slower, not faster, but more deliberate, as though each step carried intention rather than habit, each movement guided not by familiarity, but by purpose. The air had cooled further, the last light of the day stretching thin across the horizon, casting long shadows that moved with them, lengthening and shifting in quiet parallel as they followed the narrow path toward the water. No one spoke at first. There was no need. The silence between them no longer carried avoidance, but presence, a shared understanding that words, when they came, would come when they were ready. The lake appeared gradually, its surface reflecting the dimming sky in muted tones, the water still and steady, as it had been before, as it had always been. And yet, it felt different, not because it had changed, but because they had. Ed stepped forward first, moving closer to the edge, his gaze fixed on the water, not searching, not expecting, but acknowledging. "This is where we were," he said quietly. Tom nodded, stopping a few steps behind him, his posture steady, though his expression carried something that had not been there before, something closer to release than restraint. Marilyn moved to stand beside Ed, her presence calm, grounding, her eyes moving across the surface of the lake as though seeing not just what was there, but what had been. Emily remained slightly back, not distant, but allowing the moment to belong first to those who had lived it. For a while, they simply stood there. The wind moved lightly across the water. A small ripple formed, then faded. The world continued, and so did they. "We should have stayed closer," Tom said after a moment, his voice quiet but clear, no longer held back by hesitation. "We should have noticed sooner." Marilyn did not turn. "We didn't know," she said gently. "That doesn't change what happened," Tom replied. "No," Ed said, his voice steady. "It doesn't." The acknowledgement did not carry blame. It carried truth. And that was enough. Ed reached into his pocket and removed the watch, holding it in his hand for a moment before looking down at it. Its face still fixed, its hands still unmoving, its presence unchanged. "I kept this because I thought I had to remember," he said. Marilyn glanced at him. "You never forgot," she replied softly. He nodded. "That wasn't the problem," he said. He stepped closer to the water. Not far, just enough. "I thought if I held on to the moment," he continued, "if I didn't let it move, then somehow it wouldn't be gone." Tom exhaled slowly. "It was already gone," he said. Ed looked at the lake. "Yes," he replied. "It was." The words did not break him. They steadied him. For the first time, they did not feel like something he was avoiding, but something he was allowing. He crouched slightly, lowering the watch toward the water, his hand steady, his gaze fixed, his movement unhurried. "This doesn't change anything," he said quietly. Marilyn stepped closer. "It changes you," she said. That was enough. Ed released the watch. It slipped beneath the surface without resistance, disappearing into the still water as though returning to a place it had always belonged. Its final position unseen, but understood. No one spoke. They didn't need to, because something had already been said. Not in words, but in the act itself. And as the ripples spread outward, then faded, something else began to shift. Not in the lake, but in them. Morning returned in the same way it always did. Quietly, without announcement, without urgency. Yet something within it felt unmistakably different, as though the light itself carried a clarity that had not been there before, settling gently into the corners of the house where silence had once lingered with greater weight. Edward Harper was awake before the sun had fully risen, not out of habit this time, but because sleep, though it had come, had not held him as tightly as it once did, leaving behind a sense of awareness that felt both new and familiar at once. For a moment, he remained where he was, listening, not for memory, not for absence, but for what was there. The house answered, softly. At first it was almost imperceptible, a faint sound that might have been mistaken for something else, a shift in the wood, the movement of air, the distant stirring of morning. But it wasn't. It was smaller than that, sharper, steadier. Tick. Ed sat up slowly, his attention sharpening, his breath held just long enough to be certain. Tick. He stood, not quickly, not urgently, but with a quiet certainty that guided him into the hallway, where the tall wooden clock stood exactly as it had the night before, its face unchanged, except for one thing. The second hand moved, just slightly, then again, steady, continuous, alive. Ed stepped closer, his gaze fixed, his expression unreadable at first, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting into something softer, something that had not been there in a long time. He did not touch the clock. He did not adjust it. He simply stood there, watching as the moment, once held in place, continued forward without hesitation, without resistance, without asking permission. Behind him, a door opened quietly. Marilyn stepped into the hallway, her eyes moving from him to the clock, her expression changing not with surprise, but with recognition. "It's moving," she said. Ed nodded. "Yes," he replied. Tom appeared a moment later, slower, more deliberate, his gaze following the same path, settling on the clock with a quiet understanding that required no explanation. Emily stood near the doorway, her notebook still closed, her attention fixed not on documenting what she saw, but on witnessing it fully. No one spoke for a while. The sound filled the space, not loudly, not overwhelmingly, but completely. Tick, tick, tick. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because it had been allowed to. Ed turned slightly, his gaze moving from the clock to the others, then back again, as though confirming that what he saw was not just real, but shared. "I didn't fix them," he said quietly. Marilyn smiled faintly. "I know," she replied. He looked at the clock once more, the steady movement of its hands marking time in a way that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at once. For years, that moment, 4:17, had been a place he returned to without moving forward. Now, it was just a time, and that made all the difference. Ed exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing, his posture relaxing in a way that suggested not relief alone, but acceptance. The past had not disappeared. It had not been undone, but it had been faced, and that was enough. He turned toward the kitchen, the faint sound of movement following him now, not as a memory, not as an echo, but as something present, something real, something continuing. Behind him, the clocks kept time, not perfectly, not identically, but honestly, and for the first time in years, Edward Harper allowed himself to move with them.